Rob Gordon is our next speaker. He's a clinical psychologist. And Rob, you're unmuted at the moment, so I'll just let people know a bit more information about you. Rob is a clinical psychologist from Melbourne, and he works in the field of disaster recovery, and he's been involved with Ash Wednesday in 1983. He's worked with people and communities after the Port Arthur shooting, Bali bombings, Black Saturday, and numerous other disasters through Australia and New Zealand. I dare say that's pretty stressful, but we'd like to welcome Rob here this morning because I think he's got some very interesting comments and understandings to impart to us about how communities themselves, not so much the individuals, but how the community itself is impacted by disasters, and hopefully how we can be better prepared and sort that out. So I'll hand over to Rob without further ado.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks, Wendy. Good morning, everybody. So I've spent many years working in many different disasters, but a particular interest of mine has been the social process that's initiated by an unexpected, threatening, damaging event. And over the years, I've tried to find a way to think about this so that we can see a process that unfolds driven by the fundamentals of the disaster experience. And I'm going to just briefly sketch this idea out to you to try and provide an overview of the process, because our personal reactions are always embedded in our communities. And when the community is disrupted, it has a translating effect onto our own ability to manage our lives. And I want to first talk about the community process and then tie that back to what's happening to individuals. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll just go through these slides and then be able to perhaps talk a bit about it later. So let's imagine that the community before the disaster, whether it be a small rural area or large city, has got all these individuals who are the blue dots, and they're bonded together by connections, social connections, attachments. They could be just familiarity, or they could be strong emotional bonds that are shown by the lines. Now, the way people cluster together, whether it be by their locality or some other way, gives them a sense of their identity. Sorry, that disappears, but the colouring suggests that we have a sense of belonging together in a district. But of course, if you take, let's just take something like climate action, you might find that your neighbour doesn't share the same ideas as you, but you feel closer to people in another part of the community or another community. And so there's another dimension in which this very organised structure has quite a different pattern. And then if we take political views, socioeconomic status, occupation, religious affiliation, sporting interest, you can see that we could layer one dimension over the other. And on each dimension, these individuals would find a different patterning, a different closeness and distance. And this is what I think of as a sort of complex crystal lattice, more dimensions than we could possibly draw. And this is organised, including all the laws of the land and the specialist agencies like the Rural Fire Brigade and the police, etc. And the way this operates is based on a set of assumptions that come from culture and history, but which also have a whole lot of rules and regulations and so on. And the fundamental design principle for this system is to put survival off the agenda. I think that's a really important point. The organisation of the normal social community structure is to put survival off the agenda. So in other words, we can get up in the morning and go about our day-to-day business without worrying whether we'll survive the day. We've got police and fire brigades and doctors and people like that to sort all that out. So we just get up and do our farming. Now, by definition, a disaster is when suddenly an event threatens the whole community, and my survival comes into question now, and I must deal with it myself. I can't just ring the police and expect them to fix it. So the normal bonds that have provided the framework for my life and my existence are suddenly completely irrelevant. It's me and the problem, me and the gunman, me and the fire. We'll talk a bit about how drought comes into that. And so what happens then is you've got a massive disorganizing event that comes through and suddenly presents to the people a completely different issues. Let's say up on the middle here, we've got the Liberal voters, and down here on the right, we've got the Labor voters. We can see that as the bushfire comes through, it actually is completely irrelevant what your political persuasion is. You become a person surviving a bushfire, and the same with all sorts of other values. It's as though the structure that has organised our lives momentarily evaporates in favour of a here and now physical survival process. And this is shown by these dots no longer having their multiple different colours, but we're all one thing, we're all survivors. And the bonds we had before are just lost. And suddenly we're just milling around after the fire front's passed, wondering what's happened, who are we, etc. Now, I call this the moment of debonding. And I think it's a really important idea that momentarily we drop out of our structure, which means we drop out of the connections and attachments that we have. The more profound your threat, the more severe the debonding. And I think the essence of what we understand as post-traumatic stress or trauma is a profound debonding that makes it very difficult to reconnect. So that we can say that this moment of debonding, intense or not intense, depending on its degree, but to some extent will disrupt the continuity of our physical, emotional, and social connectedness. It's an unfamiliar experience because hopefully we haven't been through it before. So we tend to not recognize the debonding because we're looking out there at the threat, at the problems, at the smoke, at the ruined houses. And what is affected in this debonding is everything that we normally take for granted and therefore don't experience consciously. The focus on our own experience and what has to be done excludes awareness of what we lost, and therefore coming out of debonding back into social connectedness is not automatic, immediate, or complete. That depends on how we do it. And from my clinical work with people with long-term complex post-traumatic stress reactions, I can say that while it's often to do with unresolved issues in their life before, almost invariably, these are people that did not get the right kind of simple support to reintegrate them into a sense of community for maybe hours, days, weeks, months, or years after the event. And this prevents recovery taking place. But normally what happens is that most people, as soon as the fire is out, the flood's receded, the gunman's been arrested, they will actually immediately come together. We cannot cope with being debonded. It's a severe threat to our identity so rapidly. Everyone comes together, but we're in this red state, this state of we've all been through the same experience. Some people might leave the area, but the core that remain are in, we call it the state of heightened arousal, the adrenaline mode. We've all been through the same experience. We cling together and we work out what has to happen. And we all gain a complex communicational process that hasn't got the organisation that we had before. Everyone's close, everyone's emotional. Now I call this the state of fusion. We've lost that, all that differentiation, that separateness that we had, political parties, sporting interests, socioeconomic status, etc. We're all one thing. And that system, that fused system, will rapidly form a boundary around it. And when I'm talking to emergency management people, I say it's absolutely essential that the representatives of the recovery agencies are in there when that boundary forms. Otherwise, you're puncturing the boundary and you're coming in and you're felt to be an alien or a foreign body, and you encounter a lot of resistance. You may have experienced that. And there's a lot of resentment about agencies that rock up a few days or even weeks later after the fire, and people feel really annoyed with them. So this fusion state is the important state, because the whole task of a recovery is how does the community get from this fused plum pudding that's lost its structure through to a new complex multidimensional structure. So I call that a process of differentiation, which means a transition to a new future, integrating old and new structures, serving recovery, building a picture of a new future. And now here's the fundamental thing. When you've got this fused, tightly bonded community, it lacks boundaries, it lacks differentiation. And there is an absolutely consistent finding from social theory and social psychology and so on, experiments with rats, whatever you like to talk about, that when you have a social unit that is too tightly bonded and lacks differentiation, lacks boundaries, lacks organization, the default way in which boundaries and distance is formed is through conflict, negative emotion, hostility. And we can predict that if the fusion is allowed to run its course, it will lead to cleavages. Because as time passes, in fact, we haven't all been through the same experience. We've all had our own disaster. Even two people who've lost their house haven't had the same problem. One person might have a new, well-insured house, and the other's living in a small bungalow that their family's occupied for 4 generations and full of heirlooms. You cannot compare the loss of those two houses. It's not that one is greater than the other, it's that they're completely different. Plus you get all the other differentiations coming through. Those who are insured and those who weren't, those who are at the area and those who weren't, those who evacuated and those who stayed, those who are traumatized and those who weren't, and so on. It's just innumerable. And as the issues emerge, it puts pressure on the bonds. The communication is severed because people feel angry, they transmit emotion. And so you get this cleavage plane. I get that term from just what I know about diamonds, that there's a very strong structure, but there's a certain plane where the molecular bonds are weak. And if you hit it there, you can cut it. So in the same way, in that fusion, even though it looks so strong in the early days, the seeds of these cleavage planes are there. And as they are brought into action by whatever happens, by maybe the government giving aid in an insensitive and not very well thought out way, inexperienced governments maybe, it severs bonds. And so what we get there is all these cleavage planes open up at different times over the next, well, the period of the recovery if we're not careful. And so they're coming in and cutting arbitrarily across. You would probably be aware of how neighbours who've worked together for a long time in the country, but who've been divided by an issue, have a falling out and don't talk to each other anymore. And so that what you've got here is a picture of a sort of blind differentiation process that's occurring by destructive means. Now, the problem with that is that it's arbitrary in terms of the pre-existing social networks. And that means there is a destruction going on of the most important recovery resource, which is social networks, social support, or social capital. So the cleavage planes actually have a function to differentiate community subgroups according to the perceived differences, and therefore cut across pre-existing structures, alienate subgroups, fracture support systems, which impedes planning and decision-making, and politicizes what should be a psychosocial process. And this really, this whole destructive dynamic that opens up in communities is often what determines the damage in people's lives. It's what's happening during recovery. But if we therefore understand the need for differentiation and we enter the fusion at an early stage and actively create constructive differentiation through creating new structures and new communication systems that allow people to reorganize around their particular issue that they share with other people, the cleavage planes lose their communal function because we are giving it its organization. And so this picture tries to illustrate the formation, say, of a community recovery committee to represent the needs. In these groups around the edge, you've got different advocacy groups getting organized to put their needs forward, and the dark green lines are a disaster recovery communication network. And these really then provide a gradual process to bring conflicts together and resolve them, to transmit information, to negotiate with governments, etc. And this then is the nucleus for leading to the new multidimensional crystal structure. So this constructive differentiation is supported by community participation, validating emergent groups and incorporating them, creating new communication structures, providing a common fund of information that will bind the cleavages together, actively managing social tensions and inequalities, and promoting consistency in terms of the local community. Now, I've presented this as though it is a sequence, nice, tidy series of phases. But when I once presented this up at Shepparton in the one of the droughts in the late in the 90s, and said to them, look, this is what we see in disasters, where you've got a starting point and then unfolding. Do you think this is relevant? And what they said to me was, we recognize all those processes, but they're not happening in sequence. They're all happening at the same time with different parts of the community. And this really means these are processes. Debonding is initiated by threat. Fusion is a rebound to debonding. Cleavages occur in an undifferentiated fused community with stresses. Differentiation needs to come in as soon as possible to provide organization. And so if you imagine this as a kind of steady state, and once this was pointed out to me, I realized that's actually what tends to happen 2, 3, 4 years down the track in a badly affected community, say from Black Saturday, where you see all sorts of new cleavages and tensions opening up. And where that cuts the bonds, the people debond from each other. And then they fuse with people on other sides and so on. So this allows us to go on and develop some principles. Preparation and planning reduce debonding. It's the degree of debonding that determines the fusion. So anything that holds through the disaster will reduce the fusion. And the fusion is the major cause of the disaster disruption. If we debonded and went straight back into the structure we had, which of course emergency services are trained to do, it wouldn't be a problem. But we don't have that much discipline in ordinary life. The cleavage planes are based on perceived collective differences. We live with real differences all the time and accept them. It's the way these differences are mobilized in that fused communication system that creates the emotions. Therefore, information about what we've got in common apart from the difference sutures them up. We've got to bring people back to common ground, but that's a deliberate communication strategy. Circulating information promotes communication. Communications facilitates bonds. Common action creates constructive differentiation, and group formation promotes all of these things. So it's absolutely essential that we work with groups, and there is a whole methodology that we can talk about in how to do that safely. And so I can't go through all these in detail in the time I've got available, but I just want to show you that we can now unpack a series of techniques for strategy number 1, which is prevent or terminate the debonding. Bring the debonding to an event, to a conclusion as soon as possible. There's a second strategy, which is to minimize the fusion. That's really the disruption. And the high emotion and sort of high arousal, adrenaline sweeps away any attempt to reconstruct, and everyone's rushing around, everyone's doing things, and we get what we call the sort of chaos. And it's also the honeymoon time and some great volunteering, which often creates tremendous problems of its own right. So minimize the fusion. Then if there's fusion, there must be cleavage planes to come. Therefore, we want to construct a series of strategies to intercept and work with those cleavage planes and anticipate them. For that, we need a sense organ for the community as a whole. We need to see problems as intergroup events represented by individuals in conflict. We need to map the pre-disaster cleavages, and then we need to engage in a process of suturing them up, of stitching them up. And we can do that through a whole series of communication strategies, symbols and rituals, talk about the new future and so on. And finally, a strategy for constructive differentiation to create the planning towards the new future. Now, I know that I've just got a couple of minutes left. I just want to talk about arousal and stress. Now, this graph shows how well a person functions here on the vertical curve against how highly aroused they are. Arousal, we could say, is just the adrenaline state, the state of excitement and activation. Now, this graph shows that if your arousal is low, you don't perform too well. As your arousal increases, your performance improves up to your comfort zone, which hopefully everybody's in now. But if the arousal keeps pushing, the stress keeps pushing, you move out of comfort zone because you don't improve your functioning as you get more highly aroused. And when your arousal gets too high, your system gets damaged. And if it's extreme, you go into shock. So a really important idea is that people need to keep bringing themselves back to comfort zone to get on with their recovery process, because you don't make good decisions at either end of this curve. And therefore, people need to manage their stress. And I think there are two quite clearly distinct states. The first state is the adrenaline mode, which pushes us into the extreme state of responding to the disaster. And this is what adrenaline looks like. If you look at this man, you see the face is blank and tense. His eyes are narrowed. They're all looking at their object. They're not aware of their environment. They're very unaware of each other. They haven't stopped to get this woman carefully enough to retrieve her properly. This is a cinema fire in Calcutta. And so you can see this person is in a highly specialized state for getting the job done now, but it's not a good state for working out how to recover. And so we need to help people get out of this state. But that state will subside when the immediate threat is past. And then we move into the second state, which is endurance mode. What a massive problem I've got. Endurance mode is activated by, I've got a big threatening situation in front of me, but there's nothing I can do about it this afternoon. I can't fix it now. So it's no good going into adrenaline and running around. So we have a whole different chemistry of cortisol come in, which helps us to conserve and endure an indefinite period of privation. And you see these two people who were held hostage by Filipino terrorists for 6 weeks. And you look again at that blank face, the bright eyes that's showing they're in arousal, but there's nothing to do. And you can see they've lost all the signaling and interaction they should have between each other. And this is where relationships start breaking down. And this is the sort of zombie mode that people go through the bulk of the recovery process with. And what I observe is that if you're in either of these high stress states, your thinking is seriously impaired. You're not good at problem solving. You can't think in words. You can only think in pictures, which means you can't engage in flexible lateral thinking. You jump to emotional conclusions rather than being rational. It's very good for the emergency. It's not good for planning how you're going to get a farm that reorganized. That needs a lot of creative work. And in the emotional state, all our primitive inbuilt emotions are stimulated, the ones that get us into trouble and create a lot of distress and trauma. Our socially meaningful emotions that are the basis of resilience, regret and acceptance of loss, disappointment and moving on, sadness, compassion, resignation, these things are not available when we're in that state of high arousal. So you get this emotional turmoil. And I won't go through this in detail, but this is my recipe for how to communicate with stressed people, whether they be your neighbours, dare I say your partner in the morning, or, you know, whoever. But basically it means bring the arousal down before you do any work, and just listen. Don't talk until they're ready to listen. Don't use jargon. And because none of us can think well in high arousal, we need to go back where you don't require complex thinking. And my guideline for that is, since middle primary school is when children start to use complex ideas, try to use the language that you would use to explain what you want to say to an intelligent early primary school child. So we don't talk down to them or treat them like a child, but we use very simple words. We use short sentences. We allow pauses. We unpack the whole chain of thinking, rather than what we normally do is jump from the beginning to the end. And I just want to throw in a couple of ideas about resilience. I once spent a whole morning looking up English and Latin dictionaries. And when you push even in Latin, resile is to spring back. But sale comes from the word sale, which means reeds in the river. And when I read that, I thought that's the essence, because reeds get flattened by the flood, but as soon as it recedes, they come back up. Whereas the trees get washed out down to the sea, they can't get back up. So it's this ability to allow something to flex and deform for a while and then not lose what it needs to come back to. And so I think what we need to come back to is fundamentals of our lives that make us meaningful. And these are a few points that come out of the research on resilience. Moral compass, knowing where you're going. Flexible adaptation, being positive, self-enhancers, favourable worldviews, accepting the past is past, where do we go from here? Because really the real test is, do we move into resilience or desilience? I made the word up, the opposite. And that depends, I think, on what our community can give us. And that's why we must manage the community process, because that's where we get our strength from. So look, I'll stop the share there, and we'll see what thoughts people might have about that.
Thanks, Rob.